This video isn't gonna set the channel on fire at all. The comments are gonna be pristine and perfect. No one ever gets defensive when we talk about colonialism and cultural theft and intellectual property rights and history. Never. Everything is fine. What is cultural appropriation anyway? Let's do this. Karate. I've got a few huge thank yous this week. The first goes to Ikeda Hakubi, who, despite my efforts to specifically let my patrons know the condenser mic, roadcaster, and needed accessories for setup were going on the wish list so folks could see what I was saving for, decided to purchase the whole thing for the channel so I wouldn't have to save up my patron money. Hopefully, over the coming weeks as I fiddle with it, you all will notice a massive improvement in my audio quality. Thank you so much again, Ikeda, you magnificent bastard. You guys will hear me recording on it as of next week because the roadcaster had a European plug and I'm waiting for an adapter to arrive in the mail and it will not be here until Friday. Thank you also to Child of Nyx for picking up Singular Dedications and Book 8 of the Pre-Socratic set from Leb. A mystery donor also sent Divine Epiphany off my wish list. Thank you all so much for your support of the channel. It means the world to me and honestly still blows me away every time a package I didn't order shows up with another monograph from my research library. I have enough material for months of videos now thanks to all of you, and these donations will help me put patron money towards other improvements like picking up a camera for lives and stock footage over the coming months. Coming back to this week's topic, oh boy. To say this one is contentious in the pagan community is the understatement of the ages. To say it's contentious in general would be to underestimate the size of the wildfire of rage that seems to emerge every time it's so much as whispered in mixed political company. Well, I'm going to do my best to focus on scholarly work on the topic, as well as my own personal experience, and I'm going to take a great deal of care in how I present the information I'm about to go over. The fact remains that many folks are going to feel called out or question their own practices in light of what I'm saying. If you find yourself concerned that your own behavior might resemble some of the examples I give here, I'd encourage you to do some of your own exploration deeper into the topic via JSTOR and by reading and watching voices from minority communities other than just mine to get a wider perspective. There's more than one opinion on cultural appropriation versus exchange, and by no means am I trying to end the dialogue around this. Asking one person or watching one video or reading one article won't settle the question decisively for you either. Rather, it's an evolving conversation, one that I encourage you folks to participate in honestly and with kindness and care. We're stronger together, even when we disagree and even when we're feeling defensive. With that out of the way, defining cultural appropriation might seem quite a bit simpler than it actually is. On the surface, appropriation itself can be defined as claiming something as one's own property, which entails with it a right to privilege use and to restrict access to that thing. Cultural appropriation, then, is usually defined as claiming an idea or cultural concept originating from a cultural group outside of one's own, particularly in the case of a majority or colonialist power claiming ideas from a minority under its rule. It differs from cultural exchange in several respects, though quite often those from the majority group, unused to dealing with oppression dynamics, struggle to recognize these differences. Let's take a look at a few of the reasons why cultural appropriation might be a problem, as this might help elucidate some of those differences. To start, it's seen as problematic because it's perceived by the minority group as an illegitimate taking of a cultural good, thereby depriving the original group of the ability to enjoy of and potentially profit off of said good. For example, the marketing of Native American designs on items like t-shirts or logos by larger, more wealthy folks from dominant white class deprives the originators of these styles from supporting their communities with their own traditional art styles, as often designs will be copyrighted, thereby excluding the natives from using their own art. This becomes equivalent to theft. If you drew something nice without signing it, and some company went off and copyrighted it so you couldn't claim it or use it, and then made bank off the design without your consent, you'd be pretty upset, wouldn't you? The second problematic issue regards the cultural context of ideas when they change hands through appropriation. Often, when an idea or image is appropriated, it undergoes changes that strip it of the original cultural contexts, such as when family and warrior tattoos from various tribes are purchased from tattoo shops without the appropriate cultural context for receiving them. To members of the tribe, the sacred meaning of these tattoos is violated. and to those outside the tribe, the aesthetic is preserved without the understanding of the meaning behind those tattoos, thereby muddling the ideas surrounding them. This diminishes the cultural value and power behind these symbols, as they often serve as unifying features in a tribe, displaying someone's family line, accomplishments, or social status. And the idea that they must be earned is undercut. Think about how crappy participation trophies felt in school, and you'll get an idea of how these sorts of awards can feel. There's still prestige to be had, but it's diminished somewhat by the presence of the other. The third is an ontological issue, as appropriation can threaten the identity of the group appropriated from. This one's a little more complicated, so let's break it down a little bit. First, appropriation of cultural goods by outsiders might lead to a faulty portrayal of the original culture through misrepresentation. The classic example of this is the misuse of native spiritual traditions by predominantly white charlatans who claim training from various tribes, leading in part to the noble savage tropes in various forms of media. How many native characters have you seen that exist solely as spiritual guides for the protagonist in a story? How often do you see the idea of sacredness of the land is used as a pity trope against natives, or worse, used to portray the natives fighting to preserve their lands as the villains? How often have games and stories made use of native symbols and dress to portray a savage or underdeveloped aesthetic to a particular in-game cultural group? These forms of cultural shorthand ultimately shape the view of real-life natives in a negative light. It's impossible for the brain to fully separate stereotypes from the real humans that are attached to them. Second, appropriation can end up causing the appropriated ideas, images, and art to be inaccessible or at least difficult to use for the original culture that created them. The quintessential example here is the swastika, appropriated by the Nazis as a symbol for their movement. The association with the Holocaust and the German Socialist Workers' Party is so irrevocably tied that modern use, even of swastikas that look different to the one used by Hitler and his ilk, creates assumptions of white nationalism and anti-Semitism. Often rightly so, I might add, but for the cultures for which this sign was once sacred, they must now suffer the consequences of appropriation they had no part or choice in. Imagine what would happen if a song or story your mum told you growing up suddenly became the dominant symbol of a hate group. Silly as that image might seem, really picture it for a moment. How would you feel? I touched on the third bit earlier, but cultural appropriation performed by a group with different standards of application for ideas, symbols, etc. can create a subversion of the original culture's voice. The appropriation of the blues by white singers that ultimately resulted in the formation of rock and roll is a fantastic example of this. The white singers who appropriated the blues lacked the experiences that led to the birth of the genre, and thus the authenticity of their songs was put into question. Many aspects of the blues genre were born directly out of the oppression of African American folks by white colonizers, and lacking that element, something is lost. Couple this with the financial incentive for music labels to promote these white singers who assumed the aesthetic without the experience, and suddenly we're running into the moral problem for profits as well. The last bit is more of a moral issue and assumption. Some images and signs are part of the very identity of a group and require certain conditions to be met to use them within the group, such as the tattoos that I mentioned earlier. When an outsider uses these images and symbols without permission from the group or going through the requirements from said culture to earn their use, the assumption of a right to that symbol is created, and thereby the use of those tattoos, in this case, becomes the literal appropriation of an identity. Put more simply, when an outsider gets the tattoos of a warrior that usually must be earned through specific accomplishments in combat without having the approval of the tribe from which they come, they are making a claim to that tribe, whether they understand it or not, that they are a warrior and have made those accomplishments. Now let's say they do this and then post photos on Instagram, and a bunch more people think these tattoos are awesome and get some of their own. You can see how this quickly strips the meaning and impact of those tattoos even within the tribe. So many people have them now, why should they mean anything? The tribe must fight to teach their kids the meaning of these symbols, might raise a ruckus and make some headway, but the damage is already done. So why do these cultures feel this way, you might ask? What's so wrong with getting tattoos if you're not claiming the experiences of the warrior from that tribe and just think they're really cool? What it ultimately comes down to is a form of cultural survival. When we talk about appropriation, we're ultimately talking about a power imbalance between peoples, usually as a result of colonialism that still affects the minority group to this day. In order for the identity of any group to remain meaningful, us and other must exist to some extent. These distinctions become harmful when us is perceived as superior to other, as is often the case with colonialist powers and those they colonize. But in the case of a minority trying to retain their own identity and self-governance, the undermining of their cultural traditions and symbols, especially when you consider the often massive disparity in wealth and numbers between these groups and the dominant cultures around them, makes retaining that experience so much harder. Tell me, when was the last time you heard someone speaking Haida or Lakota outside of a reservation or sacred ceremony? Can you get legal documents in indigenous languages? Are they something that is useful to learn for any job outside of the VIA or linguistics in academia? If you saw someone in traditional tribal dress walking down the street, would that look normal to you? Is it essential to your day job that you understand who the Great Spirit is? Now, think about the flip side. What percentage of legal documents in the US are written in English? What are the chances that your boss at any given job is Christian? Do you have to worry about traditional markings or hairstyles from your culture preventing you from getting that job in the first place? Though it might not seem like hanging a dream catcher that you got from Walmart in your bedroom is a big deal, the fact remains that even being able to purchase that dream catcher from a massive corporation and hang it there is a sign that the meaning has been at least partially lost. The same goes for t-shirts with native symbols on them or indigenous quote-unquote drum classes taught at New Age shops. Though the teachers might feel like they have the best intentions in the world, ultimately the loss of cultural context for that practice for these groups is still a loss. Keenly felt when people around us claim to understand things about our culture that they've only ever seen referenced as an aside in a Ted Andrews book. Which brings me to the hot button part of this in the pagan community. Given the example of the tattoos, which you could theoretically get a friend who is a tattoo artist to do for free for you, thus stripping the profit motive, you can see even how seemingly innocuous cultural appropriation can still harm the culture from which the custom is being appropriated. Keep in mind, this applies, in my view, only to still living cultures for which the cultural act is still a significant and essential part of the culture's continued existence or identity. The idea of cultural heritage through history is very different, and religious practices from antiquity that died out outside of syncretism with more dominant religions doesn't quite apply here. Though, you can make the case for physical objects from antiquity belonging to the modern culture that succeeded the ancient groups that produced them. When you look at the definitions and examples that we just went over, the reason why becomes really clear. The authenticity and identity of a people must be tied to an idea or image for appropriation to become a moral issue, and generally oppression dynamics must exist with that culture for appropriation to even be possible. Groups on the same cultural footing tend to have more exchange, such as the importation of French cuisine to various areas in Europe, while France is still seen as the premier destination for an authentic experience. France remains authoritative in this area in the wider view, and the existence of French restaurants in other countries does not threaten this. However, when it comes to appropriation of particularly indigenous Native American spiritualities, including those from South and Central America, as well as indigenous African spiritualities, this is not the case. Sweat lodges, which are sacred practices in many indigenous cultures, are sold by white people to richer white people as self-actualization experiences, stripped of their cultural context. White sage, which I covered in a bit more detail in my video on folkism, link in the iCard if you missed it, is being driven to extinction by over-harvesting for cult shops to sell to a customer base that is predominantly not of the cultures for which the practice of smudging is sacred. So much so that these indigenous groups have difficulty acquiring their own sacred plants for their own practices. Up until 1979, it was illegal for indigenous peoples in the US to speak our own languages or practice our own tribal customs, yet authors like Carlos Castaneda sold books filled with oversimplified versions of native rites watered down for the white palate. The successor to this, the neo-shamanic vein of the New Age movement, to this day creates issues for native groups. As when we talk about our own practices, our voices are drowned out by white practitioners whose only experiences with them are in books. Even if those books are by native practitioners, the fact remains that many folks purchase them and adopt the practices without much concern for the living, breathing cultures from which these practices came. So, given the severity of the problem, you might be feeling a bit overwhelmed right about now. You might even be asking, what can I do to help? How do I know if I'm appropriating or not? The answer, as with the rest of what I covered here, is complicated but doable. First off, if you come across a practice you're not sure about, do some research around the terminology to see if you're using it appropriately. Also, if it comes from a living culture, ask yourself if you're willing to learn more about that culture than just the context of the spiritual practice. Do you care about that culture's well-being beyond the ideas themselves? Are you prepared to learn at the pace of teachers who might be willing to take you on about the culture itself? Are you willing to accept a no if there's no teacher willing to take you? When it comes to cultural art, do your best to research where the art originates from, and try and support primarily artists from the culture whose art you appreciate. Many shops exist for native prints and carvings if you like how they look, and you'll be supporting a potentially struggling artists from communities that are often known to be deep in poverty. Do some research on the artwork and its original meaning. I have a Haida print called Raven Steals the Moon from a famous Haida artist, and my knowledge of the story behind it and the rules governing traditional traditional art deepen my appreciation of it every time I stop to admire it. Granted, that's work for my own culture, but when I show it to friends and loved ones, they too often deepen their appreciation when I share the story it represents and why I have it. Most of all, remember that respect isn't an inner feeling, but an outward expression. You might feel you appreciate the tribe or culture all you want, but if you're appropriating living practices without having been taught by a person from that group, that's not respect. There's an idea that respect is felt, and it's wrong. Respect is shown, not felt. Listen to minorities when we talk about our experiences, and do your best to leave your instinctive reactions to the side if you get called out. Try to consider the point of view of the person objecting, even if it might sting a bit. Remember that oppression dynamics are complicated and difficult to navigate for everyone involved. Keep an open mind, and if you see appropriation happening, make sure you amplify the voices of the oppressed group rather than shouting over them. And don't talk for them. Like, the worst thing you can do as an ally is to drown out indigenous voices with yours. Hopefully, this gives you an idea of why some of the conversation around this topic gets as heated as it does, and gives you some things to consider that you might not have thought before. I've linked 2 JSTOR articles that should be available with the free account to help you further your research, one of which I used extensively in the definition portion of this video. I highly suggest you seek out own voices from cultures that you're interested in on YouTube and elsewhere online to further your study into various views on the topic. It is a multifaceted conversation that I couldn't hope to cover thoroughly in a single video, and it's of grave concern to pagans of all stripes, as it's very easy to appropriate in our quest for spiritual validation. Hopefully, all of us can be a little more mindful of this in the future. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, sell out the subscribe button and send the like to jail. Drop down into the comments and let me know what you've experienced in terms of cultural appropriation. Have you ever been called out for it, or have you ever had your culture appropriated? Leave me your stories. Or just tell me that I'm a lib cup or whatever, don't use a slur or I'll freaking delete your comment in the comments for daring to speak about my own experiences as a half-breed minority person, if that's your speed. Special thanks to all of my patrons. The support month in and month out has stabilized my economic situation so much that I don't have to worry near as much when I need to make investments in my channel. And there's some big changes coming down the pipeline, as all of you that hang around in my patron chat should know. I'm trying to get more funding together and save it from the contributions that I'm currently getting in order to get a decent camera for stock footage and set everything up so that it looks nice in my office so I can actually be on camera for live streams. Though I'm also doing a massive rebrand that's going to be coming out within the next month or two of all of my avatar images and such. Thank you guys again so much. It means that I can do political videos like this and not have to worry about if Dear Susan is going to take away my ad revenue. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.